Hi everybody, Keith Tanner here from Flyin Miata, and today we're going to be talking about thread repair. It's not something that's very fun to do. It's a lot less exciting than turbo kits for NC Miatas and suspension and stuff like this, but it's something we've all got to deal with because it happens. So that's going to be what we're talking about today. If you have any questions while we're shooting this, please put them in the comments. If you have any questions in the future, please put them in the comments. We will answer them in the comments in the future and live today, assuming we get the chance. We have some guys watching what's going on here, and they will relay any questions and comments to me. If you enjoy this sort of stuff that we're doing, this sort of content, make sure that you subscribe to our channel, like the content. That helps us create more stuff for you, which helps you. Everybody wins. So today we're going to talk about basically damaged threads and what to do with them. It happens. Some Miatas are 35 years old now. Sometimes you just make a mistake and put the wrong bolt in the wrong hole. Sometimes, things get hit with hammers. Who knows? Threads get damaged. And so what we're going to talk about today is ways to deal with damaged fasteners to try to save them. Sometimes it is just easier to replace, especially if it's not a very exotic fastener. Sometimes that is the best answer. But you don't have that fastener at home when you're working on things. Sometimes it's something really bizarre, something that you have to order from Mazda. It's going to take 3 weeks to get in, whatever. Don't have the time or the opportunity to deal with it. So I'm going to start with first how to basically fix slightly boogered threads. And poor Travis is going to have to zoom in on some of these things. I've got a few examples here. I was in my shop yesterday abusing threads like crazy. This one's been flattened. It's been hit with something, like a hammer, possibly. We have one here where I jammed it into the wrong size nut and messed things up. And we've got some corroded ones and just plain gooey ones here. These are all of my own personal collection of nuts and bolts, which is not as big as you might think, because I don't tend to hold on to the crunchy ones. So the most common way that people want to deal with this is a tap and die set. This is mine. It's been around. I've had it for a couple of decades at least, and it's basically a set of tools that are designed to cut threads. These are tool steel. They're very hard. They stay very sharp, and that will actually, if you drill a hole the correct size, you run that down through a hole, that will cut threads for you. That's a tap. A die is the same thing, only reversed. Put that over a piece of round bar stock and it will cut threads into it. This is the most common thing people like to do because these are useful to have around, but the problem is they're designed to cut they're designed to cut threads into metal. And if all you've got is some threads that have been deformed and pushed out of place, what they're going to do is they're going to cut new grooves into that thread, and you're going to end up with basically less thread than you started with, because all those places where it's been flattened down, that metal's going to get shaved off. If you've ever actually cut threads, you've seen that. You get all the little pieces of metal that are being shaved out or being cut out of the thing. We don't want to give that up. In this one, for example, this one that was jammed into the oversized nut, if we cut away a lot of that, we're going to lose most of the thread on the end of this, and that may be important for whatever application we're doing. So I don't recommend you go to the tap and die set. I recommend you go to a thread chaser set. This one's made by Lang. It's a US-made kit. There are Chinese knockoffs available online, of course. These start at $25. This one, which has both SAE and metric, it's about $100 for this kit. But what this does is these are a series of tools that are designed to reform threads, basically, to sort of push them back into shape, to get rid of whatever it is that has pushed them out of the way. As you can see, I'll get some side by side here. Let me in. There we go. As you can see, they're very, very different in construction. This one is got a large cutting area, quite a few of them. This one's got a lot fewer, but it does have some. This particular one is dirty. I'll get you a clean one. There we go, the 11 millimeter that's rarely used. So you can see they're very different in their construction, and they're very different in their intent. One is designed to cut threads, one is designed to reshape them and clean them. So that's why we're going to use the thread chasing kit instead of a tap and die. So let's, there's also thread files in here as well, which is another way to fix up threads. And these are a little weird to look at when you first see them, but they are basically, these are thread pitches along here. Let's see if I can find the right one. A little hard to read on this thing. There's a 1.5. I think this is a 1.5 here. So there we go. This file has teeth in it that are just the right size for these threads, and so you literally use it as a file to reshape threads. These are relatively inexpensive. You can get metric ones, you can get SAE ones. You definitely don't want to get them mixed up. And the way you use them is, as difficult as that sounds, you basically, again, double check, that's a 1.5, this is a 1.5 thread. You basically get on there and file the threads clean again. There's limitations to what you can do with this. You can't do this on the inside of a nut, for example, certainly not that one. But it is a good way to clean up a fastener that is slightly boogered up, and these fit nicely in a toolbox. You can carry them around more easily than this whole kit. But let's go back to our friend here. It is a 10 by 1.5. Well, actually, I'll show you one other good reason to use your thread chaser instead of a tap and die, is that this way you're not abusing your expensive taps when you're trying to just clean threads up. You're not filling them through the dirt and possibly destroying a fairly expensive tap. Instead, you can use these, which are designed to clean themselves out a little more. So, obviously, I need to clean that one. So this is a 10 by 1.5. I'll grab out the appropriate die in here. And the procedure for fixing these is basically very similar to the procedure for cutting new threads. Ideally, I can sort of get this started. It's moving well until it feels very crunchy. Can you hear that? Crunch, 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 crunch. So this one wasn't damaged too badly. I literally did hit it with a hammer. I didn't deform it too bad. It's enough that this goes on part way and then just kind of stops. It doesn't want to go any further. So the way we would fix this is take the reformer, run it down here, add a little bit of thread cutting oil. This stuff lasts forever. You can tell looking at this particular bottle. This has been around the Flyin Miata shop since before I started at Flyin Miata, and it's about half full. So this is 2 decades worth of Mystic metal mover. Not a great way to get into business. I wouldn't recommend you go into the penetrating or the cutting oil business, because apparently there's not much demand. But you should have a bottle of that stuff at home, because it makes all the difference. And so I didn't bring all the right wrenches for this down here today. No. So what we're going to do is basically just run this down over the threads. Now my fingers are all slippery. As I said, this one's not so bad. You're going to treat it like a tap. You know, if it starts tightening up on you, back off a little bit, let it take another shot at it. But you're basically going to run this all the way down until all of a sudden it starts running smoothly. And now you can tell we're past the damaged threads, because look at that, nice and smooth. We get up a little bit higher. There we go. It's working pretty well now. There's one section where it got particularly hammered. But that's effectively how you clean up these threads, doing that. If you look at it now, it's better. It's not perfect. But you can see there are threads cut through those flattened sections. I don't know if you can see this on the camera. And this will spin on much more easily now. And you might want to do that several times. If you have the ability to get in from the backside, if starting on the undamaged threads, that's a better way to start. If you start off here and work that way. On a blind tool, you could possibly do it that way. Or a blind hole, or a hole that's drilled through something, not blind. Might be able to start from the back, but that's effectively what we're looking to do. You can also use these, put that back so I don't get it mixed up. You can also use these thread chasers to deal with things like corroded, or, well, particularly corroded in this case, or just basically goobered threads. Anytime you're working, especially on an older vehicle, and you pull out a nut or a bolt and it looks like this, it's a good idea to run something down the threads to clean it up. Because otherwise it's going to mess with your torque settings. If you're putting this in and it tightens up because of the corrosion on there, you're not going to know that you haven't really tightened your bolt all the way. And it just makes it easier to work on. So in this case, you know, I would grab the appropriate one. Looks like a 10 by 1.25 in this case. And again, it's the same sort of deal. A little bit of, a few drops of thread coating oil. There we go. And then you would just run that down there, and that will clean off. See how dirty is this one? Not too bad. In this case, like I said, it's not so bad, so you can clean up a hand, but you can see that all of that white corrosion, that white debris that was on there, is coming off. So we've got much cleaner threads now. So when you go to put this fastener back in, it'll go in smoothly. It won't sort of bind up on us the same way. And it'll just make working on the vehicle that much nicer. When we're dealing with something like this, obviously, this nut is actually loose on here, but it doesn't really want to come out because of the amount of corrosion that's on this. Now in this case, you could maybe try to fix it just by running the thread chaser down there. It's going to be a little more work. You could also clean it up on a wire brush, just try to clean that up a little bit. If you've got some evapor rust, which is an amazing liquid that you basically just throw it in there and the rust will evaporate, thus the name. If you got some time, do that. Have a little bucket of evapor rust around, throw it in there, leave it in there for a couple of days, bring it out. It'll actually look quite clean. But basically try to clean up all that corrosion before you get yourself in trouble, because if you just try to force this nut off, chances are you're going to end up with this stuck. And then life's going to get difficult. So cleaning the threads before you try to remove a nut like this, like I said, it's moving freely. The nut's not stuck, but it does not want to go any further. Cleaning that up is going to help you a lot in the long run. Do you have any questions or comments going on over here?
Yeah.
What's going on, Mike?
So let's start with the taps. You mentioned taps and dies and stuff like that.
I mentioned taps and dies. I did.
So, as you probably experienced, what might you do if you're tapping out a bad thread and all of a sudden your tap breaks?
What might you do if you're tapping out a bad thread and your tap breaks? Now you are in a world of hurt because now you have a piece of hardened tool steel stuck inside your hole. Goodness. So that's obviously not a situation anyone wants to be in. So we are live. This is a family channel. Yeah, there's not a lot of good solutions to that. You're going to have to get the drill out. You're going to have to try to get that piece of broken steel out of there. Then you're going to have to try to fix all the damage that was done in the first place. The best way to deal with that is to do your best to prevent it. Lots of thread cutting oil. You know, don't just run it down. Don't just chuck it in a drill and go straight down there. Do it by hand. Turn it a half turn, back a quarter. Turn it a half turn, back a quarter. Turn it. That will help the threads sort of clean themselves. Might even be worth pulling this out once in a while and cleaning the tap off. You really don't want to break one of these off in the hole. If you feel things starting to tighten up and it really starts fighting you, at that point it's a time to maybe sit down and think about what your plan is going to be before you break the tap off. I don't know if I've ever actually managed to break a tap off in a hole. And a lot of that comes from starting my wrenching career on a very old Land Rover that everything was corroded, everything was crunchy, and that taught me a lot of mechanical sympathy while removing fasteners and problem solving, let me tell you. Anything else over there, Mike?
Yeah. So say that you are not able to fix your threads and you need to replace a bolt or something. Where would you go to get replacements if not from Mazda directly?
Okay, so the question is, the fastener is not salvageable. And what do you do? Where do you go to get replacements if not from Mazda directly? Mazda is a very good choice, especially for the oddball nuts and bolts. You know, things like the big long bolt that goes in the rear upright to the control arm on an NA or NB Miata is a great big long bolt on there. They have a tendency to corrode in the middle. They get all crunchy. Those basically you're not going to find one of those in a hardware store. If you have access to a hardware store that has good, and you're just looking for general mounting fasteners, little 6x1s that just hold on brackets and stuff like that, those you can easily pick up from a hardware store. Ace Hardware seems to have more metric hardware than most. If you have a good hardware store that sells good hardware, definitely give them your business because you want them to stay in town, because when you need something on a Friday night and you don't want to wait for Amazon to deliver it 3 days from now, that is if you're lucky, that is the way to go. Salvage yards are another place to go. Some place will actually sell you, I've talked to some Miata salvage yards that will basically sell you a bucket of bolts because they're dealing with stuff all the time, basically just by the pound. So that's a good way to get good quality fasteners, because Mazda uses very good quality fasteners in the car. Yes, Mike, you have your hand up.
Buy whole parts, like hardware bins from SNS Mazda Parts.
SNS Mazda Parts. Scratch and sniff, I think it stands for, doesn't it? SNS Mazda Parts will sell you buckets of bolts. Yes, they will sell you bins of random hardware. And you can't see this behind the camera, but on the other side of the camera, there is a wall of little containers of all of the cars that we've taken apart over the years, and we've saved stuff like this. All of these are Mazda, well, these are both Mazda bolts. This is a Mazda bolt. This is a Mazda bolt. These are all things that we've taken off various salvage cars. So that's an excellent source of fasteners. I would recommend buying something like that, sorting it out, just because having access to good quality fasteners in metric sizes is just plain useful all the time, even for things that aren't Miatas. Now, another thing you've got to watch for that I was going to mention is there are some fasteners that are designed to bind up. And basically mechanical, not maybe bind up, but lock up. Mechanical locking fasteners. This thing right here, for example. This is sort of stuff you might use, say, on a turbo manifold. But if you look at the actual nut, if you look down the hole, I don't know if you can see down there, it's not round. That's oval shaped. So if you are taking one of these fasteners off, or if you're putting one on and you only get down to the end of the threads and it just stops, that's not a problem with a nut and bolt. That is by design. This is basically a all-metal version of a nylock, if you will. It's designed to deform a little bit as it goes on. As I said, these are used on exhaust manifold bolts fairly frequently on Miatas. In this case, there's nothing to fix. Don't get all excited, pull out the tap and die kit, the thread chasers, trying to fix it up. Sometimes you do want them to jam into place, but it's got to be the ones that are designed to do so. So just have your heads up if you are dealing with a fastener. And this is something that can happen again if you buy a big bucket of salvage parts, salvage nuts and bolts. Some of those will be mechanical locking fasteners, especially in the 10mm size. So keep your eyes out for that. Make sure you don't accidentally use one in the wrong place. In my particular, in my home workshop, I've got them separated out so I don't give myself too much of a headache. Now, of course, if all else fails, especially when you're dealing with holes in a soft metal like aluminum, you may have to put in a Helic coil, or Helic oil, depending on how you pronounce it. And that is basically, it looks like a spring that goes inside a hole. So this is often used for, say, if a spark plug threads get completely wallered out, or the spark plug blows out of the head, which can happen if it's not installed properly, or a soft metal like aluminum gets really, really damaged. Oil pan threads as well, because the oil pan drain bolt is removed and replaced quite often in an aluminum thread in some cases, so they do tend to wear out. And so the Helic coil is basically, it looks, I don't have one here, it looks like a spring, and what you do is you drill the hole out a little bit oversized, use a special tap, an oversized tap, to tap the hole again, give it a thread, and then you thread this spring into it, and basically it's a steel insert with a thread that will give you a stronger, clean thread for you to put your nut and bolt in, or to put your bolt in, without future problems. That is what I would consider maybe not a last resort, but certainly down the line. I would do my best to fix those threads with a thread chaser first, just because it can be that much easier. Anytime you start drilling into, say if you're repairing a spark plug hole, you're drilling into the head of the car. If that's on the car, you're dropping swarf down into the piston, into the cylinder. The potential of debris damage from that is unfortunately high. So it's something I try to avoid if at all possible. You do sometimes see the Helic coils used to put a steel thread in aluminum just right from the factory. I think some of the NB oil pans did that, if I remember correctly, just to make sure that they didn't wear out over time. Mike, do we have any more comments going on over there?
Yes.
Yes, we do.
Would you like to change gears a little bit?
Are we still talking about dealing with damaged fasteners, Mike?
Yeah.
Okay, let's change some gears.
So, say that you over-torque a bolt or something like that, and now you're in trouble. What can you do to fix it, and what might that do to damage your threads?
So someone is thinking a very specific situation here. Say you've over-torqued a bolt. How do you proceed if you know it's over-torqued? Well, one thing you may have done is you may have damaged the threads. So at the very least, get it off. If you're worried about it, again, slowly by hand. Don't just hit it with the impact. Use some lubricant in there to make sure that it comes off smoothly. If you ever have doubt about a fastener, that's the way to go, is to smoothly feel how it's moving, make sure it's lubricated. Once you've got it off, you're going to do just a regular thread repair. You may want to check to make sure the bolt hasn't been stretched. If it is a bolt, sometimes it might be the better idea to replace that if it's something critical. More likely, the way you're likely to over-torque something, it's going to be something like a valve cover bolt where you've over-torqued it and you've stripped out some threads, or you've snapped the top of the bolt off. That's far more likely, in which case you've got to get the old one out of there. Easier than getting out a tap, much the same sort of concept, though. You've got to find either way to get a grip on it, or you've got to drill it out and fix the hole. But yeah, once something's been over-torqued, you've just got to take it apart and hopefully make sure that you haven't stretched a fastener that's involved. Nuts don't really stretch. Bolts, and I probably just made a mechanical engineer cry. Bolts are more of a problem, or studs, that sort of thing. There's another kind of failure mode. Now, cross-threading also will involve a lot of the same fixes. Cross-threading versus putting in the wrong sort of nut will have very similar effects. You've basically got boogered up threads. That's a thread chasing situation. There's another kind of failure, and that's galling. You tend to see this in certain types of materials. Stainless steel has a tendency to gall. Aluminum has a tendency to gall very, very badly, and it's often called cold welding, and it's exactly what it sounds like. The two fasteners, if they get too hot, they'll basically start, it's not really melting together, but they will start to bond. If you're using V-bands on a turbo system, for example, and you run the nuts on, they tend to use stainless steel fasteners because of the heat. And if you run the nuts on with an impact gun, you can easily gall the thing, in which case when it comes time to take it apart, you're going to discover that it is now one piece. It's basically welded together. No fun at all. In this case, there's really not much you can do other than, again, try to get off slowly by hand, lots of lubricant. If you can't get it apart, you're probably going to have to cut things apart and discard the parts. So if you are using that kind of stainless steel fastener or you're using aluminum fasteners, make sure you're using anti-seize, some sort of lubricant on the thing, and go slowly by hand with a wrench, not with an impact gun, and that will minimize the chance of galling happening. Galling is, if it starts happening, you'll start feeling things tighten up, and you go the other way, it tightens up again, and eventually it just welds together. It's an unhappy situation. I don't have a good answer for it. Do you have any good answers for galling, Nick? Heat.
Sometimes can help.
There you go. Sometimes, yeah, get it. Try to get to expand a little bit, give you a little more room, but yeah, it's a sad situation. I hate V-bands for that reason. I gotta tell you. Mike, anything else?
Yes. Would you like to talk about your nemesis? What has been the worst threaded application that you've had to fight?
What has been my worst threaded application I've ever had to fight? I'm going to go back to galled V-band connectors. Not a fan. Also, I used to have a super trap exhaust on one of my cars. It was actually just a tip. I called it the super tip because you stuck it on the end of exhaust. And it was attached with stainless steel fasteners that saw immense heat cycles because of the fact that they were closing off an exhaust system that was running on the track and running lots and lots of heat. And that thing, it got to the point where it could never be adjusted anymore. You could never remove the fasteners because it had completely jammed itself together just simply from the galling on the stainless steel. Otherwise, yeah, the worst fastener situation I've had to deal with is I started wrenching in Ontario, Canada, and on one of my own street cars, trying to take the rear shocks out of an NA Miata. There's the bolt that goes through the bottom of the shock, attaches to the control arm. They have a tendency to corrode, and in bad situations, they actually weld themselves to the steel insert inside the bushing. Then you start trying to remove them, you fight, and all of a sudden the bushing tears off. The bushing is no longer attached to the shock, but the steel sleeve inside is firmly attached to the bolt. So there's no possible way to get the bolt out. There's no way to get the shock off because the bushing goes through a tube. So you have to cut the bottom of the shock off in a very small space, usually with a Dremel. It takes hours. And then you get that out, and then you have to cut the bolt in half and get the pieces off. And then hopefully, if you're lucky, you can still turn it with a little captive nut inside the actual control arm. So those of you who live in rusty areas with NB Miatas, I feel your pain. I have done this. I have lain on my back in my home garage cutting shocks out of the back of a car. It doesn't really help you to fix things in the future, but let me tell you, for a long time there, every shock bolt I put into the back especially got a liberal slathering of anti-seize to prevent that from happening in the future. Anything else, Mike?
Speaking about our Lord and Savior anti-seize, could you talk about appropriate applications?
So the question is, our Lord and Savior anti-seize, appropriate applications. Yeah, the thing to know about anti-seize and torque numbers is that torque numbers are for a dry fitting. Basically, it's for putting nuts and bolts together without, do I have the right kinds here? Here we go. Without any sort of lubricant. So you do have to watch out if you're doing things like wheel nuts or wheel bolts. If you're putting those on, the torque setting assumes that there is no lubricant on there. Now, that's not always the case. If you're putting on ARP head studs, they are assuming that you are using their very specific ARP head stud lubricant, anti-seize stuff. And there are certain joints in the Miata that, again, they are expected to have some sort of anti-seize, some sort of coating on them. But if you are dealing with something where torque level is very important, such as head studs, you have to make sure that that is or is not a wet application or a lubricated application. Otherwise, you may end up in a situation where if you put anti-seize on something that's not supposed to have it, you'll over-torque and overstretch the bolt because some of that torque comes from friction in here. And as you remove that friction, things, you basically takes higher torque to get to a certain amount of stretch on the bolt. or less torque to get a certain amount of stretch in the bolt, or more stretch for a certain level of torque. That's a downside. I like to use it on fasteners where the torque level is not critical, where you know that you may have to, it's exposed to the environment, a very rusty, crusty environment, where you're going to have to get it out again. Old Land Rovers, excellent example. My old Land Rover is slathered in the stuff because of the life it leads. It spends all of its time outside. It spends a lot of time messing around in mud and in water. Everything gets wet. They're kind of corrosion prone anyway because they're British. And so yes, much anti-seize on those. Now that I live in a desert environment, I don't worry about it as much on my Miatas because they just don't see that sort of use. If I was back in Ottawa, Canada, I would be putting it on lots of things like shock bolts, for example. They usually get a lot of anti-seize. Again, the actual torque readings are not critical. It's not like a head stud. But I do want to make sure they don't glue themselves in because I'm probably not going to move it again for another decade. I don't want to curse 10-year younger Keith for not putting anti-seize on when I'm taking one of those out. Do we have any questions? Any more, Mike?
Yes.
Yes, there's more.
Favorite flavor of penetrating oil?
My favorite flavor of penetrating oil. I have PB Blaster on my workbench, which I think is basically diesel. But either way, one thing to be aware of with penetrating oil is that WD-40, the basic stuff off the Home Depot shelves, is not penetrating oil. It's WD stands for water displacement. It's great for, say, you've just driven your old Land Rover through a river and the distributor's full of water and you need to clean off the contacts. It's great for that. That's what it's designed for. It's not so good as a penetrating oil or a lubricant, so a lot of people will try it. I think they do have penetrating oil formulations, but you got to make sure it's the right one. But Croil is a good one. PB Blaster is a good one. Basically, they all stink. They work best if you put them on a couple of times, let it soak, let it actually penetrate. Give it some taps with a hammer. Sometimes those little shock loads will help it work through. But anything that is actually labeled as a penetrating oil pretty much will do the trick. And lots of penetrating oil, lots of patience, and you can get all sorts of crusty stuff apart. This has gone a little away from repairing damaged threads into dealing with crusty fasteners, but they're kind of one and the same, aren't they? Anything else over there, Mike?
Yeah. Let's talk about NA and B stuff, because that's going to be primarily...
NA and MB Miatas are the oldest Miatas, and they will always be the oldest Miatas.
Yep. Are there any bolts or fasteners in particular that you should pay attention and be careful on that are just notorious for having thread issues?
Are there any fasteners on the NA and NB in particular that are notorious for thread issues? That's an interesting and good question. Ones that don't get touched a lot are the ones you've really got to watch for. That one, can you see if you can find one of these back there, Nick? The long bolt that goes through the rear knuckle, the bottom of the rear knuckle in the control arm. It's about that long. They always seem to, they're exposed in the middle. This one is obviously off a thank you. Obviously off a Southwestern car because it's beautiful. Look at that. This whole section in the middle is exposed to the elements. This goes through the knuckle, this goes through the knuckle, and it's basically just a metal to metal, and this is exposed here. And so this is one that you've got to watch out for because this will build up, it'll actually increase in diameter with the corrosion, and it'll get a little crunchy there. There's always a little bit of movement. But this is one you do end up having some hassles with if you're dealing with a rust environment car, and I'm sure our British friends have many other stories they can tell us, because nothing rusts like it rusts in Britain. This nut can be a little hard to get off sometimes, but mostly the problem with this one is it just rusts in the middle. Doesn't usually cause a problem with actually getting the fastener on. It's mostly when you're trying to take it apart. As mentioned, the lower shock bolt in the rear is problematic, again, because it's captured in about 6 different ways. There's a captive nut on the inside of the shock, a little square thing that's just held in by a little bracket. And if that thing is welded itself to the actual bolt, you can tear it free from its cage. In which case you get a bolt that moves nice and moves easily, but just will not come out. In that case, you've got to get inside the control arm. You can usually get in there. There's a little slot. You can get in with a screwdriver and kind of wedge it in place, wedge that square bolt in place, and pull or square nut in place. Pull the bolt out with lots of penetrating oil because obviously it's jammed tightly. And then you've got to deal with the fact that now it's no longer captive, so you've got to either rebuild that little cage inside there or just deal with the fact that you put a regular nut in there and you just stick a screwdriver inside the lower control arm every time you take the bolt out. I have done both. I do have a vehicle in my particular, my stable that I took out a shock that I had put in in 1998 or something like that, so it had been in there for 23 years or 22 years at the time, and I had put a regular just nut on there, and so I had to deal with I was cursing 23-year younger Keith because because I had to hold things in place to try to get this. Anyway, it was a hassle. But that one is problematic on the rusty cars. Otherwise, in terms of ones that are easy to cross thread, can't think of anything offhand. One other thing, and this actually gives a good demonstration of it. If you do have a nut that's been completely buggered up at the end, and this is something that can happen if you're trying to remove, say, a castled nut. Say if you're trying to pop the ball joint on an NA or NB suspension, if you're doing the whole whack with a hammer thing to try to pop it off, and you miss a couple of times and you hit the top of the actual thread, it gets kind of dented in and dinged up, and the threads get too close together, you can't get it out. One way to solve that is to get a file or get an angle grinder and put a little taper on the end, like this is done from the factory, because obviously this was designed to be easily located. I don't have the nut for this, but it helps it sort of self-align as it goes in. And this is a way you can deal with, if it's just you got one or two buggered threads at the end, you can deal with that by just shaving them off, and that gives you a nice clean start, gets you down to the clean threads further down, but avoids the problem at the start. You do that on, say, a castellated nut where the actual nut is down past the holes that are in it. Again, this is the sort of thing you see on ball joints. And then you put a cotter pin through it to hold it in place. The nuts above the threads above the cotter pin are not actually holding anything down, so you can do something like this to fix them up. And that is a common thing to actually do when you're trying to pop the suspension apart on the front of an NA or MB Miata, is to accidentally hit the end of the ball joint a couple of times, and that'll help you clean that up. Anything else, Mike?
Yeah. So speaking in terms of preventing damaged threads.
Preventing damaged threads. Okay.
Do you have a favorite torque wrench brand?
Do I have a favorite torque wrench brand? Wow.
Or what do you use?
Torque wrenches are a place where I spend the money. I have a Snap-on torque wrench. I have a CDI torque wrench, which I think is the Snap-on industrial brand. It's a little less expensive than actual Snap-on, but they're made in the same factory. Good quality stuff. I tend to use clicker torque wrenches instead of the digital ones, because given my general experience with things with batteries, it would be dead when I went to use it. So I use the ones with that click every time they go. So that is one of the places where I do spend the money. I have 3 different sizes of torque wrenches for things that are important for torque, to make sure that it is as close as possible. And like I said, yeah, they are all. I've tried inexpensive ones. I had a Mastercraft. Those of you who are in Canada know what that is. And it was all right, did okay, but when it really matters, that's a place you spend the money. That and brake flaring kits are the places where you spend money. You can get away with Harbor Freight wrenches, but yeah, torque wrenches matter. Anything else, Mike? Poor Mike is trying to answer your comments at the same time that I'm asking him these questions, so he's a little distracted.
Nothing else that hasn't been answered already.
Okay, well then.
Actually, no.
Here comes there's always the last minute one. What is it, Mike?
Well, this one's for me. Have you talked about what if you don't have a tap?
Have I talked about what if you don't have a tap? How can you possibly fix threads?
Yeah.
Well, I actually, where did it go? I had an example of one I tried to do this with years ago.
It's behind the box.
Behind the box. There we go. This is a DIY tap. I took looks like a grade 8, and cut some slots in it to see if I could, and as you can see, I tapered it as well, to try to clean up threads. I don't know why I would have done it with this particular thing. Pretty fine thread on it. I honestly don't remember if it worked, but it would probably work as a thread chaser. This probably would work to clean things up a little bit. So this is one way to do it. Another way is if you know you're liable to be messing up threads if you're doing something. You're doing something, you know the thread's going to get jacked up. One thing you can do is, again, assuming you got it loose like this, spin a nut down there first, do whatever terrible thing you're going to do to the threads on the end, and then as you try to remove the nut, it will attempt to reform the threads as it goes. And it's easier to do if it starts with good threads, because once you bugger them up on the ends, it can be very hard to get this to start properly. So if you are clever enough and have enough foresight and know you're about to do something atrocious, this is a way to deal with it. I've also heard of people cutting nuts in half, putting them over a damaged thread, and then clamping them in place, and then trying to back it out. Haven't tried it myself. Interesting idea. I think you can actually buy off-the-shelf proper tools for that. If you're going to buy that, get yourself a set of thread chasers. But that is a, you know, I'm stuck in the garage. It's Friday night. All the hardware stores are closed. I need to drive to work, whatever. That is a possible thing to try. Again, can't guarantee it's going to work, but if you're screwed anyway, why not? So I think I'm going to call that for tonight, for today. If you have any more questions, do feel free to put them in the comments. We will do our best to answer them. If you've got any great suggestions, any great ideas, definitely throw them in the comments as well, because, I mean, everyone's got some experience that we can learn from, so we'd love to hear some of your solutions, or even your worst fastener stories. It would be kind of fun to see some of those as well. So throw those in the comments. And again, don't forget to like the channel, subscribe to the channel. It helps us, it helps you, everybody wins. So again, this is Keith Tanner from Flyin Miata. Thanks for your attention. I hope you don't have to use many of these tips that we talked about today, but that's life sometimes. Thank you very much. Have fun out in the garage.